right, so we'll go ahead and get started with today's program. Again, my name is Steph Morissette. I work in the Adult Services Department upstairs on the second floor, and it's my pleasure to bring you this program that has been adapted now for the classroom setting. So this program that was scheduled for last month has been reset for today. So we are going to talk about benthic macroinvertebrates. Benthic simply means bottom dwelling. Macroinvertebrate simply means an organism. An invertebrate has no backbone. So an organism with no backbone, but that's large enough, macro, for us to see with our naked eyes. So, benthic macroinvertebrates, there are quite a few categories. Here we go. Now, benthic macroinvertebrates, the different kinds, all different kinds, spend part or all of their life in water. Different classes of macroinvertebrates include worms like leeches, crustaceans like the crawdads we see here, also mollusks like clams and snails, as well as some immature water bugs. And water bugs is going to be our focus today. Water bugs include things like immature dragonflies, damselflies, and even some types of beetles. Now, benthic macroinvertebrates are important to the food web because they're like on the bottom, right? So they eat not only dead and decaying organic matter, various living plants, they might eat moss or algae off twigs, they might scrape food off of rocks, they might even eat other water bugs, tadpoles, and even small fish. So these water bugs can be carnivores or detritivores. And then they also serve as food for other organisms too, like larger fish and water birds. So what can benthic macroinvertebrates, what can our water bugs tell us? They can tell us, well, what they are is actually continuous biological indicators, which simply means they can tell us pretty much most of the time how things are going to be in our water, how our water quality is going to be. And there are three different groups. The first one is very pollution tolerant. Does anyone know about like leeches or mosquitoes? They can handle really polluted waters. Then we have somewhat pollution tolerant species like crane flies, dragonflies, and damselflies. Come on in.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. Come on in. We just got started a minute ago. All right, so we were just discussing the different pollution classes for the water bugs we're going to be discussing today. So we were at pollution somewhat tolerant. So we talked about damselflies, dragonflies, and crane flies. Does anybody know what a crane fly looks like real quick? A crane fly looks like the world's largest mosquito, right? Yeah, but they don't bite, so you don't have to be worried about it. Finally, we have the pollution intolerant or sensitive category, which means these water bugs can't handle any pollution at all. And one thing to mention about water bugs or all macroinvertebrates is that they can't adapt to sudden changes. So for instance, if there were to be, say, a heavy rain or a flood, that water is going to change, it's going to get dirty and brown. Other things might leak into the water, and we'll discuss those in a minute. So whether we see these water bugs or we don't can help us determine what type of water quality we have. So some sources of pollution that can feed into our public waterways include runoff from farm fields, such as pesticides, herbicides, or even just the soil itself. There are also industrial waste outlets. Different power plants or factories may discharge water into public surface waters. Stormwater drainage from urban areas is a big one as well. So oils and different chemicals that may be on the roads or even on our yards can filter through the stormwater drains and end up in our water as well. This one's really gross, but it's very true. Raw sewage overflow happens in a lot of cities. The discharge goes into your fresh water, just so you know. So this is why it's important that we have an awareness of benthic macroinvertebrates, our water bugs, and how they can tell us some of these environmental things that are going on around us that we may not be aware of. What do benthic macroinvertebrates or our water bugs need? They need high dissolved oxygen in the water, meaning they want as much oxygen as they can get. They also need clear water, they need cool temperatures, they need a pH in the water. So we drink our water, right? It has usually no taste, it's not acidic, it's not basic, it's just neutral. So they need neutral pH in the water, just like we do when we drink it. They also need a stratified habitat. So this would include a variety of plants, leaf litter, twigs, decaying logs, rocks, all kinds of areas, the dirt in the bottom of the creek. And this again will help determine the abundance or biodiversity, the variety of water bugs or other benthic macroinvertebrates we might find. What do water bugs or other benthic macroinvertebrates have that help them survive in the water? Well, they have physical features like claws, grasping, forelegs. Some of them have the ability to sort of spin a little silk and make a case around themselves. And just other different, like feather brushes and things like that. They have specialized behaviors. So for instance, if it gets too hot and the water temperature rises a little bit, they want to go someplace where it's cooler, like maybe find some shade where the water's a little bit cooler. Some of these guys can also hibernate, believe it or not, like the damselfly larva. Not larva, excuse me, nymph. We'll discuss that here in a minute. But they spend an entire year as a water bug before they go through metamorphosis and go onto the land as an adult. So they can do several different things. They can dig, they can dive, they can float, they can back float, they can squeeze between rocks, they can burrow, they can do lots of things. So where can we find these guys? A lot of different places. Most of the time it's in shallow, slow-moving water, but some different benthic macroinvertebrates or water bugs you can find in the middle of the stream. Some you can find under rocks and leaves, between rocks, like I said, little riffle pools behind rocks. You can find them there in little pockets. They can even be near the surface, near the bottom, or on vegetation surrounding the creek. And that vegetation that surrounds the creek is what's called the riparian area, which just means it's the vegetation that's on both sides of like a stream or a creek. So how do we catch these guys? Some of you already got your sample containers and your nets. Woo! So everybody's gonna get these today. See, you're gonna have your net to capture your water bugs. You're gonna have your neat little container here, if I can get the lid off, and it comes apart. You can extend it to make it deeper. It has a magnifying glass on the top so you can get a close-up look at your critters. And additionally, today you're also going to get this identification key, and on the back side, it also shows the pollution index, or whether those bugs you find on the front sheet or the back side fall into one of those three categories we talked about. Okay, pollution tolerant, intolerant, or somewhat tolerant. So we can find these guys in a lot of different places. So we'll need those things. Again, I'm stressing, this is going to help us tell our overall water quality. Do we have poor water quality? Do we have fair water quality? Or do we have good water quality? That's what we want to know. And of course, when we're done, we always gently release them. We don't want to harm any creatures that we may catch. So it's always good when you're finished to release them back in the same area that you found them. That's like their home, right? And they're pretty easy to sample because they don't move very far typically. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about metamorphosis. How many of you are familiar with metamorphosis? Anybody? All right, some of you. All right, some of you I'm sure you are, you just may not remember. But metamorphosis, there's two different kinds. We're going to talk about complete metamorphosis first. This has 4 stages. You have the egg, the larva, the pupa, and the adult. Everybody familiar with butterflies? That's your complete metamorphosis. Right on. First grade, right? Yeah. Then we also have incomplete metamorphosis, which is only 3 stages. So you have your egg, you have what's called your nymph, and then your adult. And a nymph is simply an immature adult. So some of these water bugs that we're going to talk about here in a minute look very much like the adult, but don't have the wings. So when they go through the last stage of metamorphosis into an adult, that's when their wings develop, and then they fly on land, like dragonflies. So we're going to talk about the dragonfly first. This guy has the incomplete metamorphosis that we just mentioned. This guy clings to weeds and plants, but he's also a predator or a carnivore. He'll eat those tadpoles or those small fish we were talking about. He also eats other water bugs. This guy here, as you can see, has a very large, chunky body. He has 6 legs, very large eyes on either side of his head. And then he has these jaws right here that fold up underneath his chin. So he can extend those out and grab his food and stuff it in his mouth. Okay, where are we at? These guys, they can handle some pollution in the water. As we know, the adults fly on land, so here you can see he's gone through metamorphosis from the nymph to the adult, and you see his wings coming out there. And they spend all their life, their adult life around water as well as reproducing in it. The female will lay eggs in the water, they hatch, develop into those nymphs, and then go through metamorphosis. They're on land. We'll talk about a damselfly next, and we'll see the difference between the damselfly and the dragonfly. So when you guys get out there, you're like, well, that looks like a dragonfly, and then you'll be able to go, that's a damselfly. So the damselfly. This is one species I was telling you that spends an entire year underwater before it goes through that last stage of metamorphosis, which is from nymph to adult in the incomplete metamorphosis. These guys are also predators, but you can see it looks very different from the dragonfly. It looks like it has 3 tails here, but those are actually gills to help it breathe while it's underwater. And here we have the 6 legs, like most insects have. All insects have 6 legs. And the eyes are smaller on either side of its head. But you see he has those jaws we were talking about, right? Those grasping jaws. What else can we say about him? He too clings to vegetation, but he is a predator. They also spend their entire adult life on land and reproduce in the water. And here is your adult damselfly. See how those wings are back? Let's look at this next image. So here we can see the adult dragonfly and the adult damselfly. So see, the dragonfly has his wings out like this. The damselfly has them back like this. Okay, so that's how you can tell a dragonfly from a damselfly, because they really look similar because they're cousins. So one wing's out, the other wings are back. Okay. Cranefly. This guy is somewhat pollution tolerant. Like I said, doesn't look like a giant mosquito. They're harmless. But you can see his body is long. He does have a couple tails here, 3. But look at all his gills. Feathery gills along his thorax and abdomen. They look a little bit like worms, but these guys are pretty much vegetarian. The caddisfly is extremely pollution tolerant. We talked about some water bugs having the ability to kind of spin a silk around them or whatnot. The caddisfly larva, is it, I can't remember. Complete metamorphosis, there we go. So he is a larva. So we have our larva here. But as you can see in this upper image, he has used those silks to wrap around his body and kind of construct a casing from leaves and little twigs or pebbles that it may find to protect itself from being predated on by another organism. And you see the adult there, looks pretty much like a moth, right? The stonefly is also very pollution sensitive. He looks like a cricket, sort of, doesn't he? But he runs along the bottom and kind of hangs on. There's an adult form. These guys also have the nymph stage or the incomplete metamorphosis. He's an herbivore. What's an herbivore? Anybody know? Yes! Plant eater. Good job. All right. So check out his body, see how dark he is. And these right here, I did want to point out, are wing plates. So when he goes through that last stage of metamorphosis to an adult, these will turn into these wings right here. We have the mayfly. This guy is very pollution sensitive as well. See, he also has his 6 legs. He has these large eyes, his head, his thorax, and his abdomen. Again, here are some gills coming off there. You can also see some feathery gills right there along his abdomen as well.
Can I ask what?
Absolutely.
What happens to the gills when they become flying creatures?
That magic that happens when they're in there encasing, I have no idea. I have heard, honestly, it sounds a little gross, but they liquefy on the inside of that cocoon or that casing, and then just basically restructure their entire bodies.
Okay.
So that's what I've been told.
Okay.
Water boatmen, these guys are kind of cute. They'll swim around and they'll dive to the bottom real deep. They use their front legs like spoons to get them through the water. But they'll dive down, use them like oars, little arms. They have some really big triangular eyes. And he's called actually a lesser water boatman because he's got a bigger cousin named the greater water boatman, who we'll meet in just a minute. So you can see those big kind of scary looking eyes. These guys are vegetarians, but what's really cool about them is they do something that's called plastron breathing or air bubble breathing. And that's where they will trap a little bubble of air under his legs and kind of use that as a breathing mask while he's underwater. These guys are also known as the water cricket because they are the loudest organism on Earth for their tiny little size. And what they do is they take those legs and they strum the middle of their thorax to make a loud drumming sound. And this attracts the females. They like the one that's the loudest. That's the one they want. So, yeah, water boatman. Now his cousin, the greater water boatman, is called a backswimmer. These guys have these really long legs, and they do just that. They swim upside down to the back of the water. So you'll see them right along the surface. These guys are also known as the water bee because they do bite. So if you see them, you may not actually want to hold them in your hand because he will leave a bite, and I've heard it's kind of painful like a bee. These guys also use that plastron or air bubble breathing, and they do the same thing. They trap an air bubble down here under their thorax, and they have little tiny hydrophobic hairs or water repelling hairs so they can hold that air bubble right there. And these guys can stay underwater for up to 6 hours. And they actually, they can fly too, so that's kind of creepy if you think about it. So they can move from one water body to another water body if they need to. So here's just a side-by-side. These guys are actually they look bigger in this image, but they're actually a little smaller. So you can see these guys are carnivores, these guys are vegetarians. They look similar, but like I said, this guy swims upside down in the water, this guy dives down. All right, water strider. These guys are very pollution sensitive, or not, excuse me, not pollution sensitive. So basically they can live in really dirty water. And it's hypothesized that the reason they're so pollution tolerant is because they actually are suspended on the surface of the water by those hydrophobic hairs we just talked about. So it keeps them suspended up out of the water. These guys are, well, they always stay on top of the water, but they can eat dead or living bugs. But did you know that water striders can also fly? And this is actually an environmental thing. So a female water strider may realize that the environment is not just right for her offspring. So what she does is when she lays her eggs, somehow, by magic again, she is able to push DNA into them that will allow them to grow wings and fly to leave the location if they need a better environment. So the female can dictate whether or not her young are going to grow wings. I think that's pretty fascinating. And then finally, we'll talk about the mosquito. These guys are really gross and creepy. This is what's called an anal siphon, which basically is attached to their abdomen, and they hang upside down in the water. But they kind of move like this. If you've ever seen a mosquito larva, they kind of move like that. Yeah. So here's a whole bunch of them. And only the female actually goes for the blood. It's the males that pursue the nectar of flowers and things like that, which I thought, wow, that's really interesting. So only the females go after the blood. And as I mentioned, those guys are really pollution tolerant. So here are just a few resources that I used when talking about these bugs. Now we only talked about a few of them, but that's because those will probably be the more common ones that you find when you go sample. And as I mentioned, you can sample anywhere there's fresh water. okay? Just look at the different places we talked about. Does anybody have any questions before we flip the lights back on and gather our supplies? Yes, sir.
Last year, we found one of the flies that makes the casing and
Caddisfly, that's a very sensitive, pollution sensitive species. That's good that you found that then.
we found a caddisfly, and my mom was so freaked out because we had no idea.